Welcome to the German Marshall Fund of the United States. My name is Heather Conley. I'm president of the German Marshall Fund, and I am absolutely delighted to have my very first public conversation as president of GMF with a real stalwart of the transatlantic relationship, Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Defense, Artis Pabriks of Latvia, a former foreign minister, a member of the European Parliament, a long and distinguished list of titles, but that all tells us that Minister Pabriks is a unique and insightful voice in the unfolding crisis that we see before us today. So, Minister, let's get started. Let's jump into this conversation. I have to tell you, reading the news reports over the weekend, a really damning intelligence assessment, and I want to get your take on it. But for our viewers, let me just briefly review. At this point, it looks like there are 130,000 Russian forces amassed around Ukraine, increase of forces in Crimea, approximately 83 Russian battalion tactical groups. U.S. intelligence suggests that Kyiv could be taken in 2 days, causing 50,000 casualties potentially, 5 million refugees. They believe Russian forces now stand at about 70% of readiness. We have upcoming military exercises in Belarus, something that I know concerns you a great deal. So, Minister, this is an enormous amount of information. What are you seeing? How are you interpreting these most recent reports?
Well, we are a border country, just like our neighbors, Estonians, Lithuanians, Poland, also Finland, which is not in NATO. So we are a border country of NATO and European Union, and we take all these signs very seriously because any kind of changes or increased military activities on the east from us, it is for us of fundamental nature and of existential nature. So we are not trying here to build a case on something, but we simply really look at this seriously, number one. Number two, for us it is very important that Ukraine is deterred and that war doesn't start. But if it starts, then Ukrainians can hold the line. This is why my country, Latvia, has been also promising a part of already long-term humanitarian aid provisions. We were promising also different type of military equipment, and also with agreement from United States, from your country, we also decided to provide Ukrainians with such things as Stinger missiles, because we think that it's not only about Ukraine. What Putin, Kremlin, with all these ultimatums want, he wants not only to subdue Ukraine, but if he is not stopped over there, then his appetite will simply grow. And it might increase internal differences and fragmentation also within Europe if we do not stand firm with Ukraine. So there is a number of issues at stake at this stage. The latest events shows actually not only this large concentration of Russian troops next to Ukrainian borders from three sides, from Belarusian, from Russian side, and from Black Sea, but it also tells us something about gambling, about poker of Putin, if I may say so. And my assumption would be that he was reading, partly maybe correctly, but he was reading from previous interactions with the West, that if he presses hard enough, then the West might tremble, it might blink. This is Georgian War 2008. This is invasion and annexation of Crimea 2014. So I think he was now assuming that if he really presses hard, we might step back, he might get a control over Ukraine. And by getting control over Ukraine, of course, he stabilizes his positions at home. And he has more possibilities to act against the Europeans, first of all, but in long term, against the Western alliance. We cannot agree on this because, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's existential.
Mr. Minister, do you think a Russian invasion is imminent, as many in the Biden administration suggest it is?
Well, I cannot say this because I do not know. We here in Ministry of Defense and countries which have a long-term history with Russia and Russian politicians, we simply calculate always the worst possible scenario. If we are wrong, it's fine. I mean, we would be happy to be wrong. Unfortunately, we were warning the West about Georgia. Nobody listened to us at the time. We were warning about Ukraine. We were warning some years ago about Belarus, because Belarus ceased to exist basically as an independent country. So at this moment, I think the decision is not made yet. Where I see the problem is that Putin is putting himself and Russia in the corner, because he is calculating, just like perhaps Hitler in 1938 and 1939, that if he presses enough, he might win. But if he doesn't, if he stands firm, he will need to find himself a way to retreat, because there are news coming out that the conditions for his soldiers at the border are not so pleasant as in our barracks here, or not as in your barracks in the United States. There are also information coming that many people are also suffering from COVID, so they are sick. So he needs to act. In which direction to act? If he acts and starts the war, it's one thing. He might also choose something within the gray area, because he sees that we are putting, all the stress on deterring this possibility of war. But what if he annexes Donbass and Luhansk? Technically, he can do this without war. He simply can annex it, and so would be the way how he would catch us also not well prepared, because what kind of action we would put against this annexation. But at home, he still would be a hero, or at least with his media in a pocket, he could sell this as a hero. The third way, if he somehow retreats, then the question is, how does he do this? How can he retreat if he was putting all the cards in poker on this game of the war? So this is a little bit of a puzzling for me, but we should not exclude, today we cannot exclude any of the three scenarios, because nothing today still signals to us that Russians are trying to kind of ease this pressure on the borders. Moreover, army is still coming, the new forces are still coming to the border area.
Mr. Minister, do you think it's an effective policy? Some analysts have described this as deterrence by description, meaning, and this is in some ways to get to the hybrid warfare challenge that you're seeing repeatedly, whether it comes from Washington or even Kyiv, describing operations that they are picking up from intelligence services. Is this effective in deterring the Kremlin, or does it become sort of, you know, the boy who cries wolf so often, and then you lose sort of credibility as you continue to highlight these potential hybrid attacks or other intentions? What's your thought on that?
Well, Heather, that's a very good question, because it has a multiple effects. And we know that in a military game, communication plays a large role. Russians are brilliant tacticians in negotiations, and they are also very good in giving their own news. So in this case, we have to play our own game, and they have a multiple effects. I think the positive part that we are describing this and giving this news out is that we are not only giving a signal to Moscow that we are serious, which is important. It's very important, because up to now, they were not taking us seriously enough, because there were red lines crossed in Syria, etc., where we did not fulfill what we were promising. But it is also important that by these information items, we are also preparing our societies, because there are large amounts, bulk of Western society, particularly in Western Europe, which simply thinks that peace is granted eternally by somebody, either by you Americans in Europe or by God or by somebody else. And they must become serious, that this is a serious game and the bombs might fall. So from that perspective, it is important to give this information. Of course, there is also a little bit of kind of a drawback or negative part, because all news agencies, they are living a little bit on the yellow breaking news approach. So if you are telling that somebody might think or the boat is going down 55 times, they might not trust you once you tell it 56 times. So that's a pattern of the news. But in general, I think that the positive aspects to keep our societies vigilant is more important. So it's not only signals to Moscow, but the signals to Berlin, to Paris, to Copenhagen, Rome, Madrid, anywhere, also to us and to your people in the United States.
I think that's a really important point. And I think you're exactly right. We're sort of watching this, but we're not internalizing what this potentially means. And these very strong warnings, particularly the most recent ones, really raise those stakes. 50,000 casualties. I mean, this would be a war in Europe, as Ukrainian President Zelensky tells us. One interjection to our audience, please send us your questions. We're looking forward to involving you into this conversation. Mr. Minister, I have so many questions right now. I'm gonna struggle to bring our audience in, I have to say. Let me turn to one of the key pillars of particularly US strategy and alliance strategy, and that is unity of allies in regards to this crisis. So I have to ask you, you certainly made some headlines last week with your very important interview regarding German policy towards Ukraine. You described it as immoral and hysterical. Immoral and hypocritical. Did you imperil the strategy of Allied unity by that comment?
Well, they were hard comments, but I must admit they were made from my love to Germany, not by a negative wish, because sometimes I'm a politician and I also represent our nation, our country, and our region. And I must say that the public here is getting highly frustrated with certain announcements from our allies in Europe. And, this my interview where I used these words of immoral and hypocritic was actually a reaction to what I heard in our public that Germany was declining to give acceptance for our neighboring Estonia to deliver lethal weapons, kind of outdated, I would say, howitzers, D-30 to Ukrainian armed forces. I must say that I myself, when I was younger, I served in Soviet army, not by my own will, of course, and I was actually the one which were shooting with such type of howitzers. So these are the weapons which still could be used, but it's not about weapons in this case. It's about attitude. And, I highly value in general Germany in Europe as a country, because Germany is the largest and central force in this continent. So if Germans are doing something, or if we want that Europe is doing something, Germany must be on the board. But now, once we speak about Ukraine, sorry for not being politically correct, because there is no time to be politically correct. We have possibly war at our borders. So I would compare the situation like we are all in unity, carrying our log for construction. And then we have these smaller guys like us in the Baltic countries. We have Poles, we even have, Swedish and Finnish, which are not in NATO, but still very much on the same line with us. And we are putting our sweat out, and with both hands, we are carrying this log. And then you have some bigger guys, which are like putting 3 fingers at this log and telling, oh, yes, we also do a common job. Yes, nominally, everything is correct. But the thing is, are you doing the stuff according to your capabilities? And this is not what I sometimes see from such countries as Germany. And I understand very well German society, especially the post-Second World War society, which was driven in pacifism and in some ways pacified by Americans, in order not to have again a war in Europe. But now we live in 21st century. And it's not anymore about Wandel durch Handel. It's not anymore about trade. It's not anymore about just, being a pleasant person. We have a country next to us technically a large country with nuclear weapons, which is challenging all its neighbors during the last decades. We need Germany on board with full force. This is what I'm meaning here, with full force. And from that perspective, I think it was important to make this wake-up call, if I may say so. And I hope that German society hears this, because otherwise they don't. And I would say that in front of us, we have a very, very long work, especially with German society, because German politicians are in many ways reflecting the position, what a majority of German society thinks. And if you look to statistics, and we follow here up very well to this, it's not extremely encouraging. You know, we even see that sometimes there is some parts of population which are trusting Russia more than the United States. And it's nice, of course, to be encircled by countries which are granting that nobody is bothering your borders. But if you do not help these countries, then the mess might come also at your borders. So we are asking Germans to be engaged. This is my biggest wish, which I would like to deliver to German society. And actually here from Latvia, we have been doing this. We already for a number of years were involved with some German NGOs, even, you know, sponsoring, we Latvians, we were sponsoring even German NGOs, you know, to our think tanks to get a discussion on these issues. We want to be heard. We want to be supported, and not only by words. Because my question always will be to our partners, in particular in Western Europe, yes, we understand if the D-Day will strike, you will be with us. But tell us how you will do this. Please tell us precisely what you will do this. And then I don't hear much of the words.
Well, Mr. Minister, I think there is some certainly sentiment in German public opinion that suggests they are not satisfied with Chancellor Scholz's public comments about the crisis. And so today we are waiting to hear what, if any, announcements come out of Chancellor Scholz's meeting with President Biden in the Oval Office. What are you looking for coming out of this visit? Are you looking for any indications of renewed German commitment? Obviously, they will review their generous economic support to Ukraine, some of their climate and green fund, some of the proceeds of which came from the agreement between Berlin and Washington regarding Nord Stream 2. But what are you looking for coming out of Chancellor Scholz's visit here to Washington?
Well, transatlantic ties for us are crucial, especially for us in the Baltic region, for Latvia. So we also believe that Germany could be one of the most important counterparts for Washington here in Europe, because, as I mentioned, is the largest and strongest country. But my wish, if I could wish and ask Chancellor Scholz and also President Biden, is please come out with an announcement that Germany is not only doing a great job and supporting Ukraine economically with all the reforms, etc., what we are doing as well from Latvian side, and we have a huge trust in Kiev, by the way, for what we are doing, larger trust than many other countries in Europe. But we would like to also hear that Germany is ready to reconsider its military support to its allies. I believe that Germany should be better presented in Baltic countries, not only in Lithuania. We would be willing, and I think the Germans, with their industry, could follow the example of United States, for instance, as far as the military assistance to other European countries, because we are receiving, and thanks for that, from Washington, an annual military assistance, financial assistance, with which we can build also our troops here, our armies, because, for instance, Latvian army is receiving from GDP now something like 2.35%. I want to rise in my government this to 2.5% in the next 3 years. Let's see how I will succeed with negotiations with our president and prime minister. But there is no other European country which is supporting each other like United States. So if we are a border country, why couldn't Germans, for instance, also give some certain military financial assistance to such countries as Latvia? We still lack equipment to which we cannot acquire by our finances because we are simply a small country. But we deserve the same security for our NATO citizens in Riga just like German NATO citizens in Berlin or French NATO citizens in Paris, we are guarding now our outside border against hybrid migrant attacks from Belarusian side, and also on European Commission still a few months ago, when we were asking for financial assistance for our borders, we received a support for refugee camps, but not for the modern installations on our border. So we want that this thinking is changed, and we want a larger support and understanding from Berlin. And I hope that Washington can encourage our partners in Berlin to think in this direction.
Well, Mr. Minister, I think it's a great idea that if they're unable to support Ukraine, they certainly can support other NATO allies with that type of additional support. And we will wait to see if your wish comes true, or if we see some greater indications of—
or at least it's heard.
Yeah, exactly, it is heard. So let me turn, if you are concerned about lack of German engagement or inaction, are you concerned about French action? So President Macron is now in Moscow. He gave a very important interview before traveling to Moscow. And I have to unpack this with you, because we know that President Macron and President Putin have been in intensive dialogue over the last several days. President Macron is, I think, very confident that he can prevent conflict, that he can de-escalate, but clearly he was suggesting in this interview that there has to be some accommodation of Russia's security guarantees. So first question is, I mean, what do you make of President Macron's diplomacy? And then secondly, we know how important it is for leaders to coordinate with their conversations with President Putin. President Biden was sort of rightly criticized very early on that there wasn't the type of consultation engagement that should have taken place. I think that's been corrected. How does President Macron coordinate with his other EU colleagues when he takes on these types of very high level, very impressive diplomacy?
Thank you. It's this question has a multiple facets I have to tackle at this moment. We of course understand that France is facing very soon presidential elections. So that's important aspect. We also know that France at this moment is presiding country in European Union for 6 months. When you were asking me about United States approach, I must comment that we were very happy that from the very beginning, Washington told nothing about you without you. And this is where we see that Americans are holding this promise and always informing us about their negotiations and also their plans, what to negotiate with Moscow. I'm, at least not me, but okay, I'm just a defense minister and vice prime minister, but I am not certain that our government knows the talking points of Mr. Macron before he visits Moscow. So we also read and we heard comments in Politico about these concessions. And then arises a question again, not only to me, but to our societies here around the Baltic Sea. Are these people who are trying to negotiate with Putin, are they representing the West? Or they are mediators between the West and Moscow? And this is a very important question, because even if formally we are now discussing with Moscow war to be or not to be in Hamletian terms, it's not about Ukraine. It's about something larger. It is about Russian expansionism and pressure against the West, against Europe, against Americans, against Canadians. And this we could read in these ultimatums, which they presented a few months ago now. Now, if Macron or Scholz or some other European leader is representing the Western interest, then first of all, it should be very important that he has talking points from the member countries, particularly from the bordering countries. It's also would be probably important before to go to Moscow to fly to Kiev in order not to repeat the pattern of Mr. Chamberlain, where Czechs were informed what will happen to them after Munich. We all know this movie now on Netflix, you know. I actually suggest to review the historic events a little bit as well. So concessions, you know, if somebody is willing to give concessions before talks start, is it a good beginning of negotiations? Secondly, do we know what kind of concessions do we talk about? Is these concessions what this poor German general was lately telling, you know, in India and lost his position about telling that we have to show respect to Putin? For us, it is here very difficult to digest. And I'm just a postman. I'm just telling what society think here. So if Mr. Macron is negotiating something about concessions or about the dinner, which we would have to pay as a border countries, then probably we are not the ones which will take the bill this time. So I'm curious not only what will come out of President Biden and Chancellor Scholz meeting, but also of the meeting between President Macron and President Putin, because we are not informed.
Well, today is going to be a very big news cycle. News day, and I'm so glad you're here to help us interpret it. Let me dig a little deeper into a reflection I think that came out in both President Macron's interview on Sunday, as well as your comments. So, you know, at the end of the day, are we clear about what this is about? Is it about Ukraine? Is it about Russia's security guarantees? Is this about Russia undoing the post-Cold War security order? Is this about the United States and Russia? All of the above. I mean, I think this is where we're getting into some confusion. What is this about? What does the Kremlin want here?
You know, it's very good academic question. Look, whenever we start negotiations or dialogue or like discussion today, we somehow have to agree on definitions. So we have a common ground how we interpret the things, and then by goodwill and listening to each other, we can make some progress. I'm frequently listening, you know, people which I respect and which are good in academic or diplomatic circles or somewhere else. Sorry if I mention one. I really sometimes, not that I always agree, but I very frequently listen discussions where is involved one of North American celebrities, Jordan Peterson. And you know what is interesting, you know, when he's asked the question, he is not agreeing on that definition, what is asked. He's challenging the fundament and taking the discussion into the different realm. And I think we must remember this when we are discussing the things also with Russians. We did not agree about definitions with Russians, not at all. They are speaking about one thing and we are speaking about another thing. Russians are not having the same diplomatic tradition as Western Europeans or Americans. And this is we sometimes are losing to Russian negotiators because we fail to see what kind of definitions they are using. Now, for instance, once we are speaking about the threat to Russia, for God's sake, who is threatening Russia at this moment? Ukrainians? We in the Baltics, where we have asymmetric powers next to our borders with Iskanders and others, and our armies are much smaller than the Russian troops over there. We also do not challenge the Russian definition about NATO expansion. You know, NATO is not expanding. It is an organization of free countries which can be entered by free countries. We never speak, for instance, when we say that United Nations are expanding across the globe and threatening somebody with human rights. We do not speak about, you know, World Trade Organization, which is expanding by force somewhere. NATO is not expanding by force. If countries next to Russia or next to any other country with a huge appetite, let's put it like this, are willing to join NATO, then just because they don't feel safe. They don't feel safe because they are under the stress and pressure. And I can tell you, if we Latvians would not join NATO, if Poles would not join NATO in 90s and later on, we would be now in a very similar position like Ukrainians. So from that perspective, I think also in our dialogue and in our interpretations and in press conferences and in news items, we must be extremely careful. How do we define the things? And very frequently I notice that we are sinning in our media and other places because we agree on the Russian definition, even if it is wrong from the very beginning. Nobody threatens Russia. Nobody is interested, to attack Russia. There are no such forces next to the Russian borders. And I will tell even more, before these ultimatums, nobody was seriously considering that Ukraine could join today NATO. We even did not consider that Sweden and Finland would join to NATO because they do not have such a public support. And I think here, for instance, Russians actually overbend the stick, if I may say so, that if on the New Year's speech, a Finnish president and Finnish prime minister both can say that, they will decide which organization to join. These are very strong words from the Finnish side, which were always trying to be kind of accommodating after their history with Russians, accommodating to Russian views. So first lesson for us is let's not agree to the Russian proposed definitions, and let's not also promote them in our own societies.
No, I think you're absolutely right. It is surprising how much we use Russia's own messaging, blaming ourselves for the current circumstance. And it also speaks to the more Russia applies this policy, the more it's getting, against its own objectives. It's getting more NATO. Countries that don't ascribe to NATO membership are now openly thinking about it. And so in some ways, it's an really extraordinary circumstance.
Well, they are good tacticians, but I don't think they're good in strategy. So here you're extremely right.
Exactly. So I don't know whether you saw this. It caught my attention. Again, it was so much over the weekend that there was an interesting article by Colonel General Leonid Ivashov, who I suppose it represents the All Russian Officers Association or something to that, where he was describing, I think, very in ominous terms, that if Russia takes this step and in further invading Ukraine, that there could be an uprising in Russia, that this will create instability within Russia if this step is taken. Put that into context for us. Is that really a former Russian military official really warning the Kremlin that this has dramatic implications for Russia's own domestic stability?
Good point, because we, of course, do not know all the nitty-gritty discussions in Russian elite and Kremlin. But as far as I know, this retired officer is not at all a Doe, rather a hardliner. He is close to the Communist Party, so he has a certain backing, even in authoritarian Russian politics. And it falls very much in line what we have been analyzing also outside Russian borders about the possible situation in Russia. Because you see, first of all, Ukrainians are, or they have been, one of the closest Slavic nations to Russians for a long, long time in history. So Kremlin managed to make basically enemies from their best friends in a very short period of time after annexation of Crimea and all the other things, what happened. Secondly, if we are looking to Russian history, regime changes, and this is what actually we in the Baltics were warning, please note it down. In history, Russian political changes usually happened in two ways, either revolution or a coup. It's not like, in traditional liberal democracies, you don't like this president, you vote for somebody else, it's not what is happening in Russia. So there are certain threats or possibilities that if invasion or war with Ukraine starts, instability in Russia might grow under the pressure also of the Western sanctions and other things, how we will support Ukraine. So I would say that this warning falls very much in line with this perspective, because one of the next challenges to us next to the Russian border could be really the regime change in Russia itself. I'm not telling that regime change would be even better than it has now. We don't know what will happen, but definitely in a short period of term, it will bring also instability to our borders, which means, again, this is a good reason to deter Russians from Ukraine for their own sake, maybe. And also, if something is changing in Russia, as far as the political environment, then we here, just like in the Cold War, can say that our borders are firm. You, dear Russians, you deal with your own country and with others there, but don't try to kind of export your instability across the EU and NATO borders. This is why we need this strength also now here in the Baltics and Poland, and also Baltic area in general. And this is a next challenge, in fact, after Belarus. Because one thing is that Russia is expanding, they can take over parts of Ukraine, destabilize the country, fragment it, they can integrate Belarus whenever they decide and continue this expansion. But it doesn't mean that internally it is internally stable. It's not at all a guarantee.
Mr. Minister, just to pull a little bit on Belarus, a country that I know you know well and have watched with great concern. Do you imagine that at this point, Belarus really has lost its sovereignty, that Russian forces will not depart, that this is a pressure point? Is that where you feel Belarus is at the moment?
Well, Belarus is serving to Russia as a very good proxy at this moment. This is our assessment. Militarily, Belarus is united with Russia. Everything what happens in Belarus is under the auspices of orders from Kremlin. How long Belarus will exist on the map as a country and what type of the country, it is solely in the mercy of Moscow. Until Lukashenko can serve these purposes, he will be there. When he will not serve anymore, something else will be there. Military force, which is now present in Belarus, according to our estimates, more than 30,000 Russian troops, in fact, as you mentioned, very close to Kiev. They pose a threat to us as well. We don't think that there is kind of imminent danger to our borders at this moment, but even if some of them are withdrawn from Belarus, the situation remains the same. Namely, the situation is as follows. The possibility of unexpected activity against our borders is larger and the period, the timing is shorter, which means we are much more exposed and we have to rearrange our planning and also deliveries and support from our allies. This is a bitter reality.
So that leads me to what else does Latvia need to shore up its deterrence? The NATO battalions were designed as tripwires. Clearly, events show that there needs to be a thickening of NATO defenses. So what are you asking for? We understand there's been a request for U.S. forces to return to Latvia, as there were at least one U.S. company there in the very beginning in the post-2014 environment. Do you envision more Canadian forces as they lead the framework nation for Latvia? What other additional defense equipment requests do you have? I mean, how can NATO support Latvia's defense?
Well, there are a number of things what we can do for our good and common good in this case, because we are not a free riders. We are ready to do more than our weight. We are ready to punch above our weight. But of course, we need assistance knowing the geography. Now, I had last week a very good meeting with the Canadian Defense Minister. She visited us here in Latvia, visited our troops. And I will give you now a short list of the things what we really could expect. As far as Canadians, we would expect that the parliament politically supports the extension of this mission as long as needed, as long as We need it. Secondly, we discussed also the necessity for Canadians to be involved in the creation of Division North, which is within the NATO framework, together with Denmark, because Denmark is a leading nation, but we need also Canadians here to be involved simply to assist to proceed with this work faster. The next thing what we would ask to United States, and according to possibility, we would ask Canadians or Germans or any other country is, first of all, please, if you see what is happening and this pressure to our borders will not decrease in the nearest years, please consider a larger military financial assistance to our armies so we can purchase equipment and to get also additional firepower. For instance, we are very much looking forward, all three Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and we actually signed a memorandum, common memorandums that we would like to purchase rocket artillery like HIMARS systems from United States. But it's also kind of expensive, so if there would be a support from Congress and Senate, we would highly appreciate that. We need in the longer term to think very much about air defense systems, something like Patriots, coastal defense systems, because former Königsberg, Kaliningrad region is a potential instability source for our coastlines as well. And of course, if there would be a permanent presence, it should not be extremely large, but permanent presence of United States troops on the Latvian soil, we would very much welcome that, because we can see what a huge difference makes the CFP group with Canadian troops here, because it's not just a presence. These guys are diplomats. These soldiers are representing their countries. The businesses run better. Understanding between our countries is much better. The training, what NATO needs internally on that level, on a company level, on a battalion level, on a brigade level, this is happening here. We are training on the daily basis so well together that if there would not be such EFP groups, they would not simply happen. So there are a number of things which you could do, and of course ask our friends in Berlin and other countries to follow the example of United States. They are Europeans. They should also think about European security in a more, how to say, inventive way. And we suggest the road how to do this.
Fantastic. Mr. Minister, we have gotten an enormous amount of great questions from our audience. I want to be able to bring them into the conversation. And I would say one of the main questions is about this interaction between Beijing and Moscow. Obviously, again, a lot of conversation about the Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin statement that came out of Beijing on Friday, this interaction potentially, the strategic conundrum for the United States that Russia would advance in Ukraine as Beijing would start to make more threatening moves towards Taiwan. Give us your sense of the interaction between Russia and China from a military perspective. Does that concern you? I mean, several years ago, we saw Russia and China naval exercises in the Baltic Sea. So this isn't new to you, but what's your sense of it?
There are similarities, but there are differences between Russia and China. China is a rising power with rising ambitions. Russia is not a rising power. Despite of all the anger and all the military force, it's very different from China. I think that alliance between China and Russia is a technical alliance of a short period of time. Because I don't believe that Russians are trusting themselves to China very much, knowing how exposed they are in the Far East. And I would say that in this moment, they are in certain occasions allied to extend the pressure against the West, against the United States, because China and United States are in kind of a confrontation in Pacific, but still there are differences. And I would say that despite of all these growing rhetorics also from Beijing's side, I would not put an equality mark between both countries, because China has a different type of history. They have a different type of mentality and political culture. And I don't think that they will. I hope not. I am, of course, not an expert in China first, but I don't think that they will act like Russians are acting. They, of course, can use Russians, for their own needs if Russians would be so unwise to increase this pressure against Ukraine or against the West. But in long term, I still would not like to believe in a great alliance. But it doesn't mean that we should not follow very closely how this cooperation is working and what China is doing in Pacific.
Mr. Minister, we're getting a lot of questions, understandably, about European energy security. And, this is, again, a huge point of leverage by the Kremlin. They did not refill Gazprom-controlled gas storage tanks in Europe. Prices are very high, impacting the economy. Europe has diversified, certainly somewhat.
A little bit.
A little bit, not enough. So how does this work with high energy prices, political figures under enormous pressure, and Russia using this gas leverage? What's the way forward?
Well, it's not a secret that until Western Europe will be dependent on Russian gas, there would be a lot of wishes to accommodate Russian interests, especially if there is somebody else who is paying for that, or to make some concessions. It's not a secret that we here in the Baltic region have been very negative about Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. Unfortunately, our partners in Western Europe did not listen to us as far as the Nord Stream, and now this dependence only continues. If you ask my personal view, maybe it's not extremely popular, but I think that Europeans should work together very fast to get energy independence or diversification of supplies. And I see here three directions. One part is, of course, all these green things, what we imagine are green, like solar panels and windmills, but I personally don't believe that they might help us to cover all the growing appetite for, let's say, electricity and energy. But I support it. Secondly, I think Europeans should go forward with liquid gas stations so we can import from other sources, not just United States. Yes, it might be more expensive. Yes, the investments would cost, but it's not just economy. I mean, it's security. It's independence, it's something more. If we are speaking so much about values, sometimes to defend values, it's also not very rational, at least not in the short term. But in this case, it's not only about money and energy. So yes, liquid gas. And the third pillar, I would suggest, is definitely nuclear energy. We have to invest in nuclear energy. We have to work with nuclear energy if we want our environment to be cleaner and more guarantees for our independence, economical independence. And I am one of the Latvian politicians which would definitely support also a nuclear power station here in the Baltic countries. I think we need it. I understand that public is sometimes scared of nuclear power, but listen, again, sorry, I will use the example of my German friends again, but when Fukushima disaster happened, about 20,000 people died. But 18,000 people died because of tsunami, and 2,000 people died of some other source. But nothing was done, and no people died from radiation or something like this. But still, Fukushima was used as an example to close power stations in Germany. It's nothing to do with nuclear power. Nuclear power is safe power and it's clean power, and we can make, by investing there, even safer and cleaner. So let's not be populist.
Mr. Minister, getting some really good questions about sort of thinking through Latvia's own internal vulnerabilities, potentially to Russian disinformation, Russian malign activities. Obviously, Latvia is home to a ethnic Russian minority. It's also home to NATO's Strategic Communications Center of Excellence. So that's where we are.
Actually, I was starting to establish. That's a great thing, really.
It is a great thing, and that's the laboratory that we can, counter malign influence. But we're also familiar, money laundering, the fragility and susceptibility of Latvian banks to Russian malign and illicit funding. So to help us understand, help our audience understand how Latvia is strengthening its own self internally to combat Russian malign operations, from disinformation to potentially illicit financing.
Good questions. 3 questions. So let's start with banks. I would say our banks learned the lesson, and in a hard way, because there have been certain banks in Latvia which were not timely taking advice. They totally changed. And I can reassure now also our American audience that our banks have much stricter rules at this moment than many other banks in such cities like London and other places. So it's not anymore danger financially here. Unfortunately, we were kind of an example on which all the reforms took place, but I think this thing is done. It's safe at this moment, definitely, as far as financial systems. There is a huge scrutiny going on here, and it's even sometimes, I would say, too much of bureaucracy at this moment. I see it also for our military industries, that we have certain problems even where there should not be. So we are working with banks on that issue as well. Second thing, as far as information campaigns, Baltics are a litmus test for Western societies. We have been undergoing cyber attacks and strategic communication attacks on us from Russians basically daily, every week. We know more or less how to deal with this. Whenever a EFP group appeared here, we were assisting also Canadian and other countries' soldiers to be ready for different type of such kind of information attacks. I think we are also quite well prepared with this, but you never know. So this information warfare, this is extremely dangerous thing. And the third, as far as the Russian minority here, we are a small country. I cannot imagine here something what happened with the Green Man in 2014 in Ukraine. Our ethnic Russian society is quite well integrated in our society. We know what is happening in our society. Most of these people, 99%, are happy to live here in Latvia. They don't want to live in Russia. They know that this is much better here. With that 1% who might have a certain wrong ideas, if they will get those certain wrong ideas, believe me, we will find them before anything happens. So I don't see this ethnic question as a kind of a challenging one for our internal security. Yes, of course, just like any other Western society, we are facing fragmentation because of different COVID-19 policies, because of economics, because people are getting more poor, and maybe there is also kind of stratification, but there is no difference between Latvia and some other Western European countries. We are rather maybe even more prepared for this. We learned our lessons, and we were going through long transition and difficult transition period in the early 90s. So in many ways, we even could imagine what might happen in Western societies, and we are ready to share these examples, particularly through this excellent center of NATO here.
Well, Mr. Minister, I want to just finish in the last few minutes that we have here, just pulling the thread of several questions, talking about what all of this means for NATO. Of course, NATO is heading towards a very important summit at the end of June, beginning of July in Madrid. New leadership, new Secretary General will need to be selected for NATO. NATO unity in light of all of the challenges that Russia has presented us. What are your hopes for the Madrid summit, and how do you believe that NATO will ultimately come out of this more strengthened on the eastern flank? How will the strategic concept reflect all of the amazing challenges that we've seen over the last several months?
Thank you, Heather. First of all, I think that it's time to see that the next Secretary General is coming from Baltic Sea region. I think it's time. Secondly, I think current events which we are facing proves that NATO is needed more than ever. Thirdly, NATO needs a certain refurbishment of their capabilities and of their thinking, which can be adapted to the challenges of 21st century. I hope it will be reflected in strategic concept, and I very much hope that it will be very much in line, or vice versa, so-called European strategic concept, also similar strategic paper, is very much in alliance with what NATO needs and thinks, because European Union as an organization should work step in step with the NATO needs. And the fourth, I very much hope that this summit will bolster also the capabilities of our European partners. They changed their attitude in the last years. There are more contributions, but it's still not enough. Europeans must get more on their feet, and without any kind of, these ideas about strategic autonomy or something. No. By that, I simply mean a larger contribution. Work at home, make your armies more capable, deliver more to NATO, make us all stronger. Europeans are rich, they should do this. And of course, I very much hope for a very, very strong engagement with United States and Canadians, because transatlantic ties we need not only in European continent, but also in Pacific.
Mr. Pabriks, what a tour de force. Thank you so much. I can't imagine a better conversation with a more insightful person on particularly today's events, whether that's German Chancellor Scholz meeting with President Biden, French President Macron's meeting with President Putin in Moscow, the issues that we need to make sure we have a full understanding of. Thank you so much. We're so grateful that you're a close partner to the German Marshall Fund, and the German Marshall Fund is going to continue to focus on the Russia crisis with all of our analysts and our research. So stay tuned for more important conversations. But again, Minister Pabriks, thank you so much. Be safe, be well, and we look forward to having you back soon.
Thank you very much to German Marshall Foundation for the great work you do, and thank you personally. I look forward to meeting you in person. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Take care. Bye-bye.